Are you a scary stories enthusiast, but don't want to live your own horror story? Well, stay safe online while exploring the unknown with Atlas VPN, your ultimate digital guardian. Developed by cybersecurity experts, Atlas VPN offers affordable protection at just $1.83 a month, with an extra 3 months free and a 30-day money-back guarantee when you use my link below. Defend against ads, malware, data theft, and keep all your searches private. And even shop smarter online by getting the best deals on products, airlines, hotels, and more with Atlas VPN. And all your devices can be protected with just a single subscription. My favorite part about Atlas VPN is that I no longer have to be blocked from my favorite streaming shows when out and abroad. Say goodbye to missing out on binge-worthy content, whether it's Friends or other legendary shows on Netflix. Unlock your favorite content from all over the world with Atlas VPN. So don't miss out. You can get Atlas VPN for just $1.83 per month, plus 3 months free, just by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment below to safeguard your digital journey. Way back in the fall of 1981, I applied to join the Texas Department of Public Safety with a view to becoming a highway patrol officer. I was accepted, and after all recruit school in Austin, I got my first duty station up in Archer County. For the first couple of years, it was everything I ever really dreamed of. I had 2 jobs, work on my bike and chase bad guys, and nothing else was worth any spit. In 1987, I got promoted to corporal, which came with a little more responsibility and a little extra pay, but I was still doing the same old thing of working on my bike and chasing bad guys, as I said. But then, in 1990, I got promoted to highway patrol sergeant. I thought I wanted the progression. It meant pay and benefits and prestige. But what I wanted was the freedom to carry on doing things my way, and being stuck behind a desk half the time wasn't my way at all. I guess it was around that time that I met my first Texas Ranger, but by happenstance, it wasn't in a professional capacity. I was sitting in a barbershop up in Wichita Falls, minding my own business, getting my hair cut, when in walks this older gentleman who looked like he'd just stepped off the set of a John Ford movie. I recognized his belt right away and how it marked him out as a ranger, so I struck up a conversation with him and asked him about his work. He went on to describe my own personal paradise. He'd worked his way up to captain by that time, so he wasn't exactly some head charger anymore, but back in his day, he had almost complete operational freedom. You gotta work your way up to being a ranger. They don't hand that kind of freedom to just anyone. But once you got it, your major would say to you, "Here's the job, go get it done," and everything else was up to you. I wanted that kind of freedom more than anything, and from what I could tell, joining the Rangers meant keeping it until I was too old and worn out to do my job anymore. So, I applied for them. I was tested in the winter of '91, accepted in early '92, and then moved down to Temple when I was assigned to Company F. I worked on a couple of cases with a partner for a while, kind of like a probationary period where you learn from a more experienced ranger. But after I was signed off, I was on my own. As long as I kept things legal, I was free to investigate however I saw fit. The only thing that mattered was getting the job done. But as the saying goes, that amount of freedom came with a great deal of responsibility too. Responsibility in the form of some very unsettling cases, and this is the worst of them. Just before Christmas of '92, a 15-year-old girl named Katie Andrew disappeared from her home in Houston. A couple of weeks go by and Houston PD can't find hide nor hair of her, so while she remained listed on the missing persons register as alive, local PD didn't have the highest hopes of bringing her home. Right about the time they started scaling back the search, I'm assigned to a motel room homicide over in College Station. The victim was a student of Texas A&M, found lying in the bathtub with her forearm sliced from wrist to elbow. Local PD thought that she had taken her own life at first, right up until they saw the ligature marks around the victim's neck. It was a homicide, but staged to look like they'd taken their own life, and at first, I didn't understand why I was being assigned to something that local was more than capable of. And that's when I was shown a piece of security camera footage taken from the motel on the night of the murder. It showed the suspect walking in and out of the room on multiple different occasions, but just once, he'd escorted what looked like a teenage girl from his car to the room and back again. A 15-year-old girl that looked a hell of a lot like the missing Katie Andrew. The way it was explained to me, this psycho was dragging her along on some godforsaken criminal rampage, and it was only a matter of time before he killed her too. And it was my job to stop that from happening. We had a potential suspect almost right away. He was said to be a member of some fringe church over in Kent County, some real strange folk over in Kent back in those days, and Jonathan himself had several run-ins with the law. But what made him my prime suspect was the fact that he'd been previously arrested for trespassing and harassment of another 15-year-old girl. It was her parents who'd filed the complaint, and the report was strange from start to finish. But what caught my eye is that our suspect, in the midst of just walking onto someone's property uninvited, had asked the girl, "Is your name Katie?" He'd been looking for her long before he'd ever found her. But what made Katie Andrews so special? What was the connection between them? I figured if I'd worked that out, the whole case would just unravel in front of me, but just as I was getting to work interviewing people and trying to get some answers, our suspect dropped a second body. At the motel over in Harker Heights, about only 20 miles or so from where I lay my head at night, a maid walked into a room to clean up and found herself standing in the middle of a nightmare. A 17-year-old high school girl had been crucified on an upturned bed frame, and our killer had carved her up, piece by piece. It looked like death by 1,000 cuts, like he'd tried to open up every blood vessel in her body one at a time. Now I know what you're thinking. If they bled this girl out, how come the blood wasn't leaking under the motel room door? Well, that's just the thing. There wasn't hardly a spot of blood on the floor of that motel room. I figured the killer put some kind of plastic sheeting down to try and keep the crime scene clean. But now, I'm not so sure. I helped Harker Heights PD search the crime scene from top to bottom, and it was there that we found an earring belonging to Katie Andrew. It was tucked into a pillowcase, meaning that there was very little chance it just fell off and into that pillowcase while she was sleeping. We figured she put it there to let us know that she was still alive and had been at the motel. But again, I'm not so sure about that anymore. We figured that they were headed west, so I drove out towards Lubbock to link up with a couple of boys from Company C. We hoped that we might be able to cut our suspect off before he committed a third murder, so we canvassed every motel we could with photographs of Katie Andrew and our suspected killer. We figured it was only a matter of time before we got a call from one of our motel owners, but when the call finally came, it was to give us the news that a third body had been found. Only this one bucked the trends in a serious way. Instead of a young woman, the victim was a grown man, and instead of being attacked in a motel room, the victim was murdered in their own home. But again, unlike the other murders, which appeared to have some kind of method to their madness, this third one was just a complete horror show. The victim was lying on his kitchen floor. There were no wounds to his limbs or torso, but his face was barely recognizable. Someone had bitten him. Real deep bites, too, all over his face. When people use their teeth during a violent struggle, it usually results in a chunk of flesh being torn from whatever they were biting. It's an instinctive thing from man's dark past. A person bites down on their aggressor, or in this case, their victim, and then in the course of the struggle, the bitten flesh is removed. Think of it like a bear trap. Once that piece of flesh is in its grip, it's too late to do anything about it, and struggling only aids the cause of the biter. But in this case, there hadn't been any flesh ripped away from the guy's face, no chunks of skin missing from the guy's cheeks or chin or jowls. There was only bite marks, some intersecting and overlapping, but there had to be 100 of them. The guy's face was completely and utterly mutilated. As you can imagine, the change in technique had me very bothered. The idea that our suspect was forcing Katie Andrew to watch all these hideous crimes, possibly as some kind of psychological torture that said, "This is what's going to happen to you." I'll admit, I lost some sleep over that. But when the autopsy report came back and we read the county coroner's findings, everything changed. According to the report, the bite pattern of the victim's face were slightly too small to have been made by a grown man. Instead, the coroner suggested that the bite pattern belonged to a much younger person, someone who hadn't finished fully developing yet. I didn't want to believe it. I don't think anyone wanted to believe it. But the evidence was right there before our eyes. Either our suspect had tried to throw us off by switching up his MO and using a pair of dentures, or our abduction victim wasn't nearly as much of a victim as we thought she was. By that point, I'd thrown all preconceived notions I've been carrying out the window. The idea that Katie had been a runaway was dismissed fairly early on in the investigation. She was an average student, a quiet kid, and kind of easily led, according to her parents, and considering the suspect had a history of harassing girls named Katie, I figured it was a straight-up abduction, and that little Katie was simply too scared to try and escape. Lord knows, if one of the first things she saw was her abductor strangling another girl to death, it made sense that she'd been terrified into compliance. But if those really were Katie's bite marks all over our third victim's face, then maybe he'd gone and flipped some kind of switch in her. If that was the case and she suddenly stopped wanting to be found, then my job just got a whole lot harder. Assuming he might not want to be seen anymore, we stopped circulating pictures of Katie and we focused on photographs and photo fits of our suspect, and that of the vehicle we suspected him to be driving. With the help of local sheriff and police departments, we flooded the area between Killeen and Odessa with as much information as we could, and told everyone and their dog to keep an eye out for our suspect, or more specifically, his vehicle. And it paid off, and on February 27th of 1993, I got the call that closed the case. I get a message on my beeper from a deputy over at the Sterling County Sheriff's Office asking me to call him back, and when I do, he tells me a concerned citizen had called in a tip regarding the Katie Andrews case. The citizen claimed to have seen a truck driving onto a small construction site just off the 87. He thought it was strange, since the place was always deserted on weekends, but when he got a little closer and recognized the truck, he called the sheriff's office as soon as he was able. He also added that the driver looked like he was driving around the back of the half-constructed home, almost like he was trying to hide it from the view of passers-by. That was all the information I needed to hear, and as soon as the sheriff over there had granted me the company of a few of his deputies, I drove over to Sterling City, and we rolled out together around sundown. It's moments like that that made me want to join law enforcement in the first place. We were all on four wheels, but it felt more like we were riding out there like some old posse led by Jack Hayes or Bill McDonald. Sure, the whole thing might turn out to be a damp squib, but by God, it felt good to be on the move, armed for bear, and all with the same purpose of rescuing an innocent little girl. But it wasn't a dud, and we found our man when we stormed that half-built house. He just wasn't in the condition I thought I'd find him, never in a million years. We wanted to keep the elements of surprise as best we could, so instead of rolling up on that place with our lights and sirens blaring, we took the exit before the house, parked on this little dirt road, then stalked our way across the brush with only a crescent moon to light our way. We had a deputy with a 12-gauge and beanbag rounds go in first, not wanting any collateral damage if our perp proved to be armed, but as we listened out for any signs of activity, we didn't hear anything at all. So quietly as we could, we stacked up at what served as an entrance, covered by a plastic sheet, then flicked on our flashlights and stormed the interior. The place was just a skeleton on the inside, with only one or two pieces of paneling closing off one of the rooms. We could see signs of life before we walked through the open doorway. Discarded wrappers, empty soda cans, that kind of thing, but we couldn't see what was going on in there until we actually were in the room, or what was intended to be a room anyway. The deputy with the beanbag shotgun went in first, and he kind of pulled back from the sight of something before letting out this "Sheriff's Department, show me your hands." His heart was nowhere near in it, and I'm surprised he could even get the words out to begin with, because when I saw it, I'll be honest, it took my breath away. Hanging by the neck from one of the beams above our heads was our suspect. He didn't look like he'd been dead too long. He was in a hell of a state, but he still looked fresh. It always gets me in movies when someone walks in on a hanged person and they look pretty as a picture, because in real life, it's just about the ugliest thing you'd ever want to see. But right at his ankle, holding on and looking like she was crying, was what looked to be a teenage girl. I suddenly understood why our man was so reluctant to shoot, but he crept forward saying something softly like, "It's gonna be okay, we're the cops, you gotta come with us now." She didn't want to leave him at first. She just kept on clinging to our dead perp's ankle, sobbing like you wouldn't believe. We actually started to relax a little. I know that sounds crazy looking back on it, but our suspect was dead and we had her hostage. Only thing to do was to get her out of there as quickly as possible and end her ordeal once and for all, so that's what we did. We backed up out of the room, assuming our point man was about to lead little Katie out of the half-built room, and then, in the sort of flash, it was happening. The point man screamed. Katie rushed forward. He fell back. She fell on top of him, and in a flurry of flashing light beams, we all saw the knife swinging wildly for the deputy's throat. There was nothing else to be done. Katie was an imminent threat to that deputy's life, and as much as I saw fit to lunge forward in the hopes of tearing her off of him, one of the other deputies acted exactly as his training told him, and he pulled the trigger. Sadly, Katie didn't make it to the hospital alive, and the deputy was in critical condition for almost 3 days afterward due to the amount of blood he'd lost. We did everything we could for both of them, and the deputy who shot ended up not coming back after his extended leave had run out. It was a nightmare situation, but it was take one life or risk losing more, and in those decisions, there ain't no time for that. I was the one who had to deliver the news to her parents, and let me tell you, that was just about the hardest thing I ever had to do. Telling them was one thing, but then telling them how it happened, that was another thing entirely. You'd be amazed at how well Mr. and Mrs. Andrews handled receiving the news. Some of the bravest folks I'd ever come across now that I really think about it. I think they'd long accepted that it was just a matter of time before they got the news that every parent prays they'd never hear. In the interest of giving them as much closure as possible, I told them everything I'd learned in the course of the investigation. I've been giving them regular updates on whatever progress I've been making, but after we got the news about the bite pattern, I stopped being so liberal with what I was telling them directly. The same applied to the press around that time, too. We didn't want to feed them too much information on account of news reports spooking our perp. They were both headed west in a very steady pattern, like they were headed to somewhere, so naturally, we didn't want to do anything to change that and mess up our chance of tracking them. I did make sure to tell Katie's parents about the bite marks, mainly as a way of trying to explain why Katie might have become violent with the officer. She might have been completely traumatized, brainwashed, you name it. Stranger things have happened with abduction or kidnap victims. But the one thing I didn't tell them was that we found a note in that half-constructed house, written by our dead suspect. We first thought that he hung himself because he didn't want to go to prison, figured that he heard what they'd do to chomos over in Huntsville, but his note said otherwise. I looked at that note many times over the years, so many times that I can almost write it out from memory, and it said, "Get the Mescalero, find Palmer, he can help. Otherwise, take your own life. If you don't, it'll keep happening and it won't ever stop. I'm sorry, Katie." I don't know what any of that meant at the time, and to be honest, I still don't. But as for telling Katie's parents about it, they had enough unanswered questions to live with that I didn't want to saddle them with another one. Before I left, I promised them that I'd find out why Katie was taken and where she was being taken to. It was a promise that I couldn't keep. When I finally managed to crawl into bed in the early morning hours of that Sunday, I had a whole plan laid out in my head. I was going to find where this kid was getting his cash from, because an unemployed man, having just shy of $1,000 in cash on him at the time of his death, That raised a lot of questions. Then, I was going to find out who Palmer was by talking to some boys over in New Mexico, because Lord knows if they and our perp had partnered up once, they might have done it God knows how many times before. To me, the case was still very much an open one, and as I closed my eyes that morning, I saw myself working on it for years and years. But when I woke up a few hours later, fixed myself some coffee, and flicked on the TV news, I knew that Katie Andrews' case was going to be on the back burner for quite some time. On the TV, armed men with ATF on their flak jackets were climbing ladders onto the roof of some house. It looked like it could have been almost any house in central Texas, the kind of place that you might call home, and then my jaw drops, as this ATF agent, trying to pull down some black curtain from a window, starts taking incredibly heavy fire from inside the house. Bullets are ripping up the wall next to him. Then a bullet rips up through the roof just behind him, where someone else inside the home beneath him is trying to shoot him through the roof. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then suddenly some kind of caption appeared at the bottom of the screen with one word in particular catching my eye. Waco. That Sunday was the beginning of the standoff between local and federal law enforcement and the Branch Davidians, led by the now infamous David Koresh. What happened to Katie Andrews should have been a huge story in its own right, but it was completely overshadowed by what happened the very next morning. Maybe if it had been a one-and-done type of thing, then I'd have got the help that I needed to investigate all those loose ends. But that siege went on for months, and the whole time, any kind of police work above murders and highway patrol came to a complete standstill. Everyone tried to help out, including many of the Company F Rangers I served with. No one is proud of how it ended, but I'm even more ashamed of the account that I left unsettled with Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. I never was able to get to the bottom of why their daughter had to die, and you can put it down to a scared deputy with an itchy trigger finger if you want, but anyone with half a brain knows it goes a lot deeper than that. What made Katie try and hurt people who'd come to rescue her? And what kind of help did our perp think she needed? I consider myself lucky that I never again encountered a case of that nature. I didn't fail another family. I didn't fail a little girl. And I never went up against nothing I couldn't explain to myself in one fashion or another. I can't handle having dealt with just one case like that, let alone 2 or 3, because sometimes I catch myself wrestling with some unanswerable questions and coming up with answers that made me feel like a scared little kid again. Just after midnight on December 13th of 1990, the lifeless body of 33-year-old Mary Lou Pratt was discovered lying in a yard in a low-income neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. She had been stripped, beaten, and then executed with a single .44 caliber gunshot to the head. Within hours of her body's discovery, the case had been handed to Detective John Westfalen, a tobacco-chewing East Texan who dressed like a cowpoke and spoke like one too. Detective Westfalen was familiar with Mary, who by her mid-30s was one of the most seasoned escorts in all of Oak Cliff. But of all the hookers he expected to find dead on the street, Mary was somewhere near the bottom of his list. Mary was no stranger to violent Johns, but it was no accident that she'd survived in such a dangerous line of work for so long. Mary was extremely savvy with her business and very rarely plied her trade to strangers on the street. Instead, Mary tended to visit a small number of so-called regulars, some of whom she trusted enough to drive her home for the night. But apparently, some of that trust had been gravely misplaced. Following her transportation to the Dallas County Coroner's Office, Detective Westfalen made sure to witness Mary's autopsy. The gaping hole in her skull quite clearly spoke to the cause of death, but those in attendance soon noticed something else regarding the condition of Mary's body. As Detective Westfalen and his partner stood a short distance from the blue plastic cart where Mary's body lay, Dr. Elizabeth Peacock peeled open the departed girl's eyelids. She had done so to make a note of Mary's eye color, but all that stared back at her were 2 empty sockets. Dr. Peacock was morbidly impressed. Mary Pratt's eyeballs had been removed so carefully that her upper and lower eyelids were left completely undisturbed. The doctor told the watching detectives that it would have taken someone of extreme skill to carefully cut away the 6 major muscles holding each eye in their socket, meaning there was a horrifying chance Mary's killer was a skilled surgeon. Detective Westphalen knew that he was facing an uphill struggle. With no murder weapon, witnesses, or significant forensic evidence, there was little chance of answering the many questions which surrounded Mary's murder, namely, what kind of person would do something so twisted? A few hours later, Dallas Patrol officers Regina Smith and John Matthews clocked in for their morning shift. The 2 officers' area of operations included a once popular shopping district just off Jefferson Boulevard that had drastically deteriorated over the previous 25 years. Financial decline preceded a sharp rise in crime, which meant drugs, homelessness, and, most importantly, prostitution. Smith and Matthews' assignment was to establish a presence in the area through community policing. Instead of aggressively prosecuting those involved in petty or nonviolent crimes, Dallas PD sent Smith and Matthews to gather intelligence that would lead to the apprehension of the more dangerous or insidious criminals. But to gather intelligence, they first needed to win the trust of some rather unconventional allies. Many in the Dallas PD referred to the beat as a public relations job, but Smith and Matthews could have been more accurately described as heavily armed social workers. Rather than arrest the many prostitutes that frequented Jefferson Boulevard, the 2 officers focused primarily on their safety. Anyone caught turning tricks during the daytime would be tossed in a cell, but those who plied their trade at night in the quarantine zone of the ultra-sleazy Star Motel were essentially free to do so as they pleased. As the girls became increasingly appreciative of the police protection, they began to talk, and soon Smith and Matthews had established a deep rapport with several of the girls, along with a rough picture of local organized crime networks. The morning of December 13th was much like any other, and as the 2 officers approached the Star, they soon noticed one of their regular customers. During Smith and Matthews' first meeting with Veronica Rodriguez, the 26-year-old had defied their presence by soliciting a John right in front of them before aggressively resisting any attempt at engagement. A few months later, Veronica was greeting the officers with a friendly smile, but she remained a remarkably stoic young woman. So when Smith and Matthews turned onto Jefferson that morning and spotted Veronica waving them down with a panicked look on her face, they knew something was terribly wrong. The moment they pulled up next to her and rolled down their windows, Veronica leaned into the car and yelled, "I almost got killed last night." She went on to explain that right in the middle of that night, her John had snapped and attempted to strangle her in a cornfield south of Dallas. Veronica was known to tell the odd, tall tale, but on this occasion, the officers were in no doubt that she was telling the truth. Veronica then told them that she'd been saved by a passing stranger who'd chased her alleged killer off, yet when asked for the name of this knight in shining armor, her memory suddenly grew hazy. A few days later, the plot thickened when Smith and Matthews found Veronica sharing the cab of a truck with a balding, middle-aged Caucasian man. Confident that she was trying to work during prohibited hours, the 2 officers attempted an arrest. But as they hauled the trucker out of his cab and ordered Veronica to do the same, she suddenly begged them not to arrest him. "Please don't arrest him," she reportedly said. "That's the man who saved me from being strangled." After putting him in handcuffs, Smith and Matthews learned the man's name was Axton Schindler. Aside from a few unpaid parking tickets, Schindler's record was completely clean, yet the officers then listened as he claimed Veronica's story was complete fiction. He hadn't saved her from any attack. He wasn't even one of her Johns. He was just an old friend doing her a favor, at least so he claimed. Regardless, Schindler was hauled down to the department to pay off his fines while Veronica was arrested for breaking the daylight ban on propositioning. To Smith and Matthews, it seemed like just another day on the job, yet months later, they'd realized a huge clue to Mary Pratt's murder had been hiding in plain sight. A few months later, on the morning of February 10th, 1991, 27-year-old Susan Peterson was found dead on the same street Mary Pratt was found. Susan had also been a prostitute and, much like Mary, had been severely beaten before being stripped down to her underwear and shot in the head. Interestingly, although Susan's body had been dumped on the very same street as the first victim, it was technically outside of the city limits. This meant that instead of Dallas Police Department, the second murder fell under the jurisdiction of the Dallas County Sheriff's Department and their top homicide detective, Larry Oliver. Larry was unfamiliar with Mary Pratt's case, meaning that he had no idea that he had a potential serial killer on his hands, but just like Detective Westfalen, he had made sure to be present at the autopsy. He too discovered that Susan Peterson's eyes had also been removed, and with the same careful precision as the first victim. The next day, Detective Oliver drove over to the Dallas Police Department to speak with John Westfalen. The two detectives were initially reluctant to toss around the term serial killer, yet the gravity of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. They were dealing with a highly dangerous, highly deranged individual who was almost certainly planning another of his signature murders. In order to try and prevent further deaths, flyers warning of a potential spree killer were posted around Jefferson Boulevard. There was no mention of the surgical removal of the victim's eyes, but a deep sense of communal panic set in all the same. Smith and Matthews found that even the most hard-faced working girls of Jefferson Boulevard were now only too happy to talk to them, but while the move was fantastic for community relations, it deeply frustrated Detective Westfalen. He understood that preserving human life was paramount, but the warnings would not only reach potential victims, but they'd also reach the killer, who in turn might significantly change their tactics and techniques or attempt to evade justice altogether. By mid-March of 1991, Detective Westfalen had accumulated 4 notebooks worth of case study pertaining to the Oak Hills prostitute murders. He'd also overseen several undercover units that had been sent to stake out the area of Jefferson Boulevard. They had run computer checks on the license plates of vehicles that cruised by just to see if the owners had priors, but the stakeouts yielded nothing and were soon discontinued. March 10th would see the detectives one step closer to the answers, but it would come at the cost of another victim. 26-year-old Shirley Williams was found dumped on a residential street in the heart of Oak Cliff, just blocks away from an elementary school. An unopened condom had been placed next to her corpse, and just like the previous 2 victims, her eyes had been surgically removed. As news of the third murder spread, Jefferson Boulevard became a veritable ghost town. Many of the prostitutes had moved out of town for the foreseeable future, planning only to return once the killer had either been caught or moved on. Those who were desperate enough to ply their trade went out in 2s or 3s, and often with a pimp or their hired muscle watching from a parked car nearby. Smith and Matthews kept up their patrols and were surprised at how many of the girls still ventured out to make a buck. One of them, a woman in her mid-30s by the name of Brenda White, claimed to have survived an attack just a few days prior. She told Smith and Matthews that she'd been picked up by a man with salt and pepper hair, cowboy boots, and blue jeans. Brenda had suggested the pair head to a hotel, but her John said he knew a better place. This was a huge red flag to the veteran prostitute who'd learned never to head to an undisclosed second location, and especially not with the first-time John. She attempted to exit the man's vehicle, but at that moment, and to use her words, a change came over his face. It was like an anger, rage, she said, and then he started screaming, "I hate you. I'm going to kill all you mother effers." Brenda said the man then lunged at her, but she already had her pepper spray in hand. She sent a stream of burning vapor into his eyes, jumping out of the car, and ran off into the night. Given that Brenda's description of the man was oddly reminiscent of the previously arrested Axton Schindler, Smith and Matthews decided to run his name through a more thorough background check. This is how they discovered that Schindler's address, 1035 El Dorado, was registered to a deceased man named Fred Albright. Fred Albright owned another piece of property in Dallas, one that just so happened to be in the very same neighborhood that Mary Bell and Susan Peterson were found. The two officers reached out to the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, who, as you remember, have been working the case in tandem with the Dallas Police Department, and when they asked if the same Fred Albright meant anything to them in connection with the murdered prostitutes, there was a pause on the other end. The two officers later said that it must have been a penny drop moment for the deputies over at the Sheriff's Department, and, in time, they explained why the connection was so chilling. Not long after Mary Pratt's body was found, the department had received an anonymous tip from a woman claiming to be a friend of the deceased. The woman asserted that just prior to her murder, Mary had been dating a man named Charles. Whether this was professionally or recreationally, it's difficult to say, but the anonymous woman claimed Charles had an unhealthy obsession with Mary's eyes, to the point that she found it intensely unsettling. Investigators had initially shelved the report and were planning on returning to it later, but after the call from Smith and Matthews, it held a terrifying new relevance. You see, Charles was none other than the adopted son of Fred Albright, but the question remained, how were he and Axton Schindler connected? After perusing his extensive criminal history, the detectives pulled up one of Charles' mugshots. It showed him to be a fairly handsome, well-built man with grayish hair, angular features, and deep-set dark eyes, exactly like the man Brenda White had described. Smith and Matthews rushed in to inform Detective Westfalen of the huge break in the case. With his blessing, the officers then tracked down Brenda White and showed her the picture of Charles Albright. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who attacked me." Smith and Matthews then tracked down Veronica Rodriguez, the girl whose story had seemed strangely off. She might have made up many tales in the past, but this time, she clearly wasn't lying. The moment she laid eyes on the photograph of Charles Albright, she started to tremble. Then, just like Brenda White, she pointed at his face and then told the cops, "That's him." Just after 2:30 in the morning, under a shower of light drizzle, a SWAT team smashed in the back door to 1035 El Dorado. The exterior might have looked decrepit, but the inside was beyond luxurious. One cabinet was filled with expensive crystal champagne glasses, while another held an extensive collection of highly sought-after Jadro figurines. In the bedroom, Charles Albright was caught completely by surprise, and as the heavily armed SWAT team dragged him out of bed and snapped handcuffs around his wrists, his young girlfriend began to wail in confusion. Whatever Charles had done, it was clearly a serious matter. The only problem was he seemed like the last man on earth to ever break the law. "Look, I've known Charlie for 30 years, said Albright's friend, a retired Baptist minister. And all that time I think I would have seen his dark side slip out at least once. Believe me, if he really was a psychotic killer, he couldn't have kept it a secret all this time, could he? In 1933, when he was just 3 weeks old, Charles was adopted by Fred Albright and his young wife Dell. According to Dell, Charles' birth mother was an exceptionally bright student, but was just 16 years old when she fell pregnant. Her furious parents demanded that she put the baby up for adoption or face familial exile, and the girl chose the first option. As a boy, Charlie was known to be a happy but eccentric young man of above-average intelligence. By 7, he'd memorized the names of all the constellations and was such a talented tap dancer that he was booked to open for a nationally renowned tap dance troupe at the famous Texas Theater. Charlie was just so much damned fun, recalled a childhood friend. We were always waiting to see what he'd do next. Surprisingly, Charles had a remarkably stable childhood for someone who grew up to be a serial murderer. But as he grew older, his adoptive mother began to exercise some rather unusual parenting techniques. Dell Albright became so afraid of dirt and disease that she would change and wash her son's outfits up to 3 times a day. She would occasionally take him to polio clinics to gaze at those suffering from the disease, locked away in their iron lungs, prisoners to their infections. "If you don't keep clean," she'd tell little Charles, "this is going to happen to you. You'll spend the rest of your life in one of those things." This strange behavior continued for some time, until the unusual descended into the downright abusive. She would sometimes lock him in a dark room as punishment for the smallest disobedience. When he wouldn't take a nap, she would tie him to his bed, sometimes for 12 hours at a time. When he wouldn't drink his milk, she would spank him brutally until his back and legs were a patchwork of yellowing bruises. The Albrights' neighbors noticed how odd Dell seemed to act, especially around her boy, but Charles never complained on account of his mother's harshly taught lesson of, if you ain't got anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. If you asked Dell, she'd say that she was so overprotective of her adoptive son because of how precious he was to her. For whatever reason, the Albrights couldn't conceive naturally, and this no doubt put a great strain on Dell's mental health. But as we've already learned, those feelings manifested themselves in some very unhealthy ways. She recognized Charles' intellect and nurtured it as best she could. But while piano lessons and private tutoring might seem par for the course, teaching a young child taxidermy is unconventional at best and inappropriate at worst. As Charles set to work on the dead birds his mother encouraged him to bring home, his mother would lavish him with praise. She too had taken an interest in the rather morbid hobby and passed her knowledge on to her boy. She showed him how to use a knife to cut open their tiny skulls and how to use a specialized kind of spoon to cleanly scoop out the brains. But without a doubt, the most difficult part of the process was removing the creature's eyes from their sockets without damaging the socket or surrounding skull. To ensure that he could properly perform the task, Dell Albright spent hours forcing her son to practice the process over and over again. He'd use a tiny scalpel to separate the soft tissue, and then use a pair of minuscule forceps to carefully remove the lumps of flesh from the bone cradles, all without cutting too deep or pulling too hard. When it came to birds, pruning the feathers and wiring the legs were perhaps the most crucial parts of the process. But when it came to the difference between just a good piece and a great piece of taxidermy, it was all in the eyes. Charles would regularly join his mother on trips to her favorite taxidermy store and would spend as long as he could staring at the rows and rows of intricately crafted glass eyes. But they were far too expensive for the repugnantly frugal Dell Albright, who told her son that if he wanted them, he'd have to save up his meager allowance, and so Charles' taxidermies ended up going without. They'd stare back at him with the dark, empty eye sockets. Despite his bizarre and slightly abusive upbringing, Charles performed wonderfully in high school and went on to enroll at the North Texas State College over in Denton. However, once he got there, his behavior took a dramatic turn for the worse. Charles was arrested for several burglaries that resulted in hundreds of dollars worth of goods being stolen. He claimed innocence when he got caught, but his mother refused to loosen her purse strings and attempted to act as her son's lawyer. He ended up spending his 18th birthday in prison. Once he was released, Arkansas State Teachers College was a chance for a new start, and for a while, it seemed as if though Charles was headed for high achievement. Teachers often complained that Charles didn't study, but then were flabbergasted when his grades came out as mostly A's and B's. Unsurprisingly, anatomy appeared to be Charles' strongest subject, and some teachers suspected that he would go on to medical school and a career as a surgeon. Charles might have been taking his studies more seriously, but his love of pranks remained. In one instance, one of Charles' friends had just endured a rather rough breakup and, in a bit of frustration, tore up several photos of his ex before throwing them in the trash. Then, unbeknownst to his heartbroken friend, Charles retrieved the photographs from the trash can and began cutting out their eyes with a kind of arts and crafts knife known as an X-Acto blade. Over the days that followed, Charles' friend began noticing little strips of paper stuck to various points around their home. There was one above his head, one on the back of the bathroom door, even one over the kitchen counter, and on each one was a pair of deep brown eyes, the eyes of his ex-girlfriend. Charles thought it was hilarious. His friend violently disagreed, and after a tense confrontation, the strips of paper disappeared. After eventually dropping out of college, Charles entered the job market, but did so entirely on his own terms. He faked a teaching certificate to get a job at a high school in the nearby town of Crandall, but was forced to resign when his deception was uncovered. Since he was a popular member of the staff, the school promised to give Charles his job back if he attended Arkansas State Teachers College, but he was kicked out soon after his enrollment for stealing school supplies. Then, apparently on a whim, Charles enrolled in beauty school and eventually gained a beautician's license. He then found a job as a stylist at a local hair salon where, again, he proved himself a popular member of the team. Not long after, Charles discovered that one of his associates was seeking to commission a portrait of his wife. Charles claimed that he'd paint a world-class picture of her for just $250. The associate was skeptical, as Charles' claim of being an award-winning artist seemed dubious at best, but shockingly, every word was true. Charles was indeed a talented self-taught painter, and had once won a prize at the Texas State Fair for his portrait of a dark-haired woman in a long green dress. He worked on the painting of the man's wife for weeks on end, and when he finally was done, it was magnificent. The man had expected something that he could hang on his wall, but when Charles announced that it was ready for collection, the man found the frame was 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. The coloring was rich but realistic, and the proportions were so lifelike that it could have fetched 10 times the price at a gallery. But without a shadow of a doubt, the most alluring, transfixing aspect of the painting were the subject's eyes. Charles claimed to have dedicated an entire week to ensuring that the eyes were nothing short of perfect, ensuring the proper amount of shadow under the lashes, the right droop around the lids, and the correct amount of shading to the subject's pale blue iris. Until then, Charles had led something of a mischievous but harmless existence. He might have had sticky fingers and a penchant for forgery, but he'd never hurt anybody. And that all changed in March of 1985. Sometime in 1979, Charles had begun attending St. Bernard's Catholic Church on Old Gate Lane in East Dallas. He was said to have a fine singing voice, occasionally aided the church's priest in his holy duties, and sometimes would bestow generous acts of charity on some of the congregation's less fortunate members. And this is how he first met a young family, down on their luck, who just needed a little help getting by. Charles slipped the man of the house a $100 bill during a church service. The man fought back tears, and a deep friendship was cemented. However, half a decade later, the 14-year-old daughter of the family shared a shocking and long-held secret with her parents. Charlie Albright, one of the most pious and popular members of St. Bernard's Church, had been violating her, and he'd been doing so for years. 51-year-old Charlie denied the accusations, vowing passionately to clear his name, but on March 25th of 1985, he stood before a judge in a somber Dallas courtroom and pled guilty to the charges of knowingly and intentionally engaging in deviant intercourse with a minor. Charles essentially went into hiding following the conviction and went on an extended trip to Arkansas to wait out the media storm. It was here that he met Dixie Austin, the woman who he was sharing his bed on the morning of his arrest for murder. Dixie would later claim that she had no idea of her boyfriend's murderous nature and recalled how he'd spent most of his spare time hunting salamanders out in the woods. Charles told Dixie that one of his dreams in life was to discover a brand new species of salamander so he could name it after himself. At this point, it wouldn't be surprising if Charles really was some kind of accomplished amateur reptile expert, but on this occasion, the story was a cover. Charles wasn't off looking for lizards. He was looking for ladies of the night, and for considerably more sinister purposes than their preferred form of commerce. One of the first girls Charles encountered was a married mother who plied her trade after her husband had gone to work and her children were at school. She later recalled feeling sympathy for him and how he seemed to want company more than relations. He was a sweet gentleman, she reportedly said. If I ever needed extra money, I would call him and he would drop it off. This relationship continued for many years until finally the woman began refusing to see him on account of his increasingly aggressive temperament. In one instance, Charles handcuffed her to a bed and began whipping her with an extension cord while yelling, "Scream if you like it. Scream." Charles is thought to have maintained several such relationships with several different women, including his future victims, Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson. Yet he didn't develop a thirst for murder until the deaths of his adoptive parents. Following his father's fatal heart attack in 1986, Charles inherited a fortune of almost $100,000, along with all of his parents' homes and property in South Dallas. For sentimental reasons, he kept all the property in his father's name, and to bring in a little extra cash, he rented out one of the smaller homes on a street called Cotton Valley to a husky-looking truck driver by the name of Axton Schindler. With little income coming in, Charles decided to move into the old family home in Oak Cliff, with Dixie Austin moving in not long after. Theirs was a quiet, romantic life, until the veneer was suddenly shattered one morning by the emergence of a horrifying truth. When he was first detained on suspicion of murder, Charles refused to say a word to the arresting officers. He was taken back to his cell, then investigators set about searching his many properties. They found X-Acto blades, a copy of Gray's Anatomy, and at least a dozen true crime books, but there were no obvious murder weapons and, more importantly, no eyeballs. Both Axton Schindler and his girlfriend Dixie both acted as crucial alibis for Charles, and for a while, it looked as if though a conviction was going to be impossible. But the Dallas County DA had a trick up their sleeve, and for the first time in U.S. history, they were going to seek a murder conviction based solely on hair evidence. Just days after Charles' initial arrest, the Dallas Forensic Lab discovered that tiny hairs found on the bodies of the dead prostitutes were almost identical to hairs taken from Charles' head and pelvic area. While this might be considered circumstantial to some, the lab was also able to determine that minute hairs found in Charles' truck were identical to samples taken from Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, as well as those taken from the third victim, Shirley Williams. It was an unconventional link, but it was the only one that had put Charles behind bars, so, with some hope and a prayer, the prosecution went to work. Charles' defense attorney claimed that the prosecution's case hinged on flimsy, unreliable evidence, and that the real killer was most likely Axton Schindler, who just so happened to have fled Dallas a week before the trial. Granted, Charles was an eccentric man, but he was no killer, and the attempt to link his impressive extracurricular activities to the actions of a psychopath were a grave insult to his character. Yet the jury saw through the defense, and on December 19th of 1991, he was pronounced guilty, then sentenced to life in prison. Charles vowed to fight the case on appeal and welcomed a series of journalists into his cell to profess his innocence. "I never touched an eyeball," he told one. "I truly think, and this may sound far-fetched, that the boys in the forensics lab cut out those eyes. I think the police said, 'We want some sort of mutilation to gain more attention to the case,' and that's how I got roped into this whole thing. It's a miscarriage of justice." Charles continued to fight his case from the John Munford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas, and did so until the year 2020, when he passed away from an undisclosed medical condition. It marked a rather anticlimactic end to such a storied life, as many had hoped Charles would open up about the murders later on in life. There was a lot of speculation regarding other potential victims, and without a full and frank admission on his part, it's more than likely that Charles took many dark secrets to his grave. Yet thanks to a full and forensic analysis of his upbringing and early adulthood, I believe it's possible to place an educated guess on why Charles did such terrible things. A person's formative years are the most important of their entire lives, and the things they learn at that age are carried with them into later life. Little Charlie should have been out riding a bicycle or had his nose buried in a storybook, but instead, his deranged and abusive mother watched him carve out the eyes of dead birds before telling him, "Good boy." On May 2nd of 1949, James Byrd Jr. was born in Jasper County, Texas, the third child of Stella May and James Byrd Sr. Stella May was a Sunday school teacher, while James Sr. was a deacon at the Greater New Bethel Church over in East MLK Boulevard. Both parents attempted to instill their son with a strong moral compass and respectable work ethic, and for a while, Jr. kept himself on the straight and narrow. But it wasn't long before James Jr. fell in with a bad crowd, which led to some very poor decision-making on his part. Between the ages of 20 to 37, James was arrested on several different occasions on charges varying from theft and forgery to violation of parole. The last charge saw him do a serious stretch in prison, but after that, James vowed to turn his life around. And by 1998, a 49-year-old James was working on and off as a vacuum cleaner salesman. He was also known to walk wherever he wanted, meaning he was most likely banned from driving in some capacity. James could have quite easily evaded the ban by borrowing a friend or a relative's car, but doing so might have risked violating his parole, so instead, he walked. On Sunday, June 7th of 1998, James walked all the way across Jasper County to spend the evening with some friends and family. There was music, a cookout, and an inflatable mini pool for the kids. Then after a few beers and a healthy digestion period, James summoned up the stamina to walk back home. Shortly after 2 a.m., James said goodbye to those in attendance and then walked onto the dark streets of Dallas, never to be seen again. Sometime between 2:30 and 2:45 a.m., James was walking along a long, dark stretch of road when a pickup truck pulled up next to him. The men claimed to recognize James from his many walks around Jasper County and offered him a ride to wherever he was going. James then climbed into the bed of their truck, and the driver took off down the road. However, instead of taking James to his intended destination, the driver took him east, all the way out of Jasper County, to a small clearing in the woods. There it's believed that James was told to get out of the truck, and realizing something was terribly wrong, he did so. But when he tried to get away, the truck's driver, along with 2 other men, chased James along into the clearing and attacked him. Forensic evidence suggested James put up one hell of a fight, but he stood no chance in the 3-on-1 struggle against younger, fitter men. Once they got the better of him, and James was lying on the ground, his attackers continued the assault, landing blows all over his body before spray painting and urinating on him once he was firmly unconscious. The men then dragged James' unconscious body back to their truck, tied a chain around his ankles, then attached the chain to the rear bumper. James was then dragged 3 miles along Huff Creek Road, and an autopsy suggested that he had remained alive and conscious for at least half of it before his bones were broken and his body was torn apart. What remained of him was dumped in front of a historically African-American cemetery on Huff Creek Road. The next morning, the police found traces of James's body in 81 separate locations along the highway, along with one majorly significant clue, a cigarette lighter with the word possum inscribed in it. Given the sheer horror of the crime at hand, there was a massive incentive to solve it as quickly as possible. The carnage that unfolded that night wasn't something that they could block off or hide. It was spread along 3 miles of highway, and as news of the murder swept through the city like wildfire, people were horrified by what they heard. The Jasper County Sheriff's Department were soon finding themselves contacted by the FBI, who wished to offer their assistance on account of the extreme nature of the case. They returned within hours with a break in the case. Possum was the jailhouse nickname of a 23-year-old man named John William King, who was on an FBI watch list after associating with a known white supremacist group. King also had several white supremacist tattoos and was discovered to be a full-patched member of a jailhouse neo-Nazi organization known as the Confederate Knights of America. King was arrested, and after a brief investigation, it was discovered that the 2 other men in the truck that night were named Sean Berry and Lawrence Brewer. At the murder trial, it was established that 23-year-old Sean Berry did not share John King's politics, but was found to be just as culpable in James Byrd's death as his 2 racist companions. 31-year-old Lawrence Brewer, on the other hand, was a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist, who prior to Byrd's murder had served a prison sentence for drug possession and burglary. According to his court testimony, he joined a white supremacist prison gang along with John King in order to safeguard himself from other inmates, yet the prosecution painted a picture of a man who joined with enthusiasm as opposed to reluctance. One of their chief witnesses was a psychiatrist who stated that Brewer did not appear in the least bit repentant for his crimes and, at one point, referred to him as, and I quote, a racist psychopath. The prosecution coupled their expert's testimony with a note intercepted by the guards of the jailhouse where King and Brewer were being held. Proven to be in King's handwriting, he described knowing that the murder of James Byrd might result in a death sentence, but that he did it anyway. Regardless of the outcome, we have made history, one passage read, before he signed off, death before dishonor. Jail officials also mentioned that both King and Barry had attempted to obtain a copy of a book entitled The Turner Diaries whilst awaiting their trials. Published in 1978, the Turner Diaries were written by the rabidly racist William Luther Pierce, one of the founding members of the since-defunct National Socialist White People's Party. The novel depicts a violent revolution in the United States which leads to insurrection, nuclear holocaust, and ultimately a race war which leads to the systematic extermination of Americans' ethnic minorities. It's been described as being explicitly racist and anti-Semitic by the New York Times, and an FBI expert on white nationalist terrorism once called it the Bible of the racist right. While it might be acceptable to obtain a copy of the novel for academic purposes, King and Brewer's desire for it was obviously not innocent and provided yet more evidence that the murder of James Byrd Jr. was not only first-degree murder, but motivated solely by racial hatred. At the trial's conclusion, Sean Barry was spared the death sentence and instead sentenced to life in prison. The jury acknowledged that the crime was never something Barry would have instigated alone, but since he failed to stop it, a share of the blame was his to shoulder. As of 2023, Barry is living in protective custody at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Ramsey Unit. He spends 23 hours a day in an 8-by-6-foot cell, with 1 hour for exercise, most likely because white supremacist prison gangs such as the Aryan Nation have put a bounty on his head. He'll be first eligible for parole in June of 2038 when he is 63 years old, but frankly, it'll be a miracle if he survives until then. Lawrence Brewer, in all his unrepentance, was sentenced to death by a jury of his peers. He was executed in the Huntsville unit on September 21st of 2011. The day before he was put down, Brewer told Houston's KHOU 11 News, as far as any regrets, no. I have no regrets. I'd do it all over again to tell you the truth. Shortly afterwards, he sat down for his final meal. Brewer's existence had been just a blip on the radar of the Texas penitentiary system, but the request that he put in for his last meal had significant consequences for hundreds of other death row inmates. Brewer's order included 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and sliced onions, a triple patty bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, a bowl of fried okra with ketchup, 1 pound of barbecued meat with half a load of white bread, 3 fully loaded fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, 1 pint of Blue Bell vanilla ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts on top, and 3 large root beers. When the meal was presented to him, Brewer looked over at the massive spread that had been laid out for him, looked at a correctional officer in the eye and told him, "I'm not hungry." Due to some kind of food safety regulation, the prison officials were not permitted to repurpose the giant feast and were reportedly forced to throw the entire thing in the trash. The news prompted outrage from the people of Texas, and State Senator John Whitmer petitioned prison officials to end the 87-year-old tradition of giving last meals to condemned inmates. The prison agency's executive director responded by stating that the practice had been terminated effective immediately. On April 22, 2019, John King's appeals to both the Texas Court of Criminals Appeals and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles were denied, and he was executed at the Texas State Penitentiary on April 24, 2019. While it's easy to celebrate King's death, it's harder to fathom why James Byrd had to die in the first place. But instead of succumbing to anger and despair, James's family found the strength to turn something ugly into something beautiful. In the years following his death, family members helped establish the James Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing. eccentric former basketball player Dennis Rodman donated $25,000 to the foundation, while boxing promoter Don King established a $100,000 college fund for Bird's 3 children. Perhaps the best way to sum up their attitude is to recount their joint statement in the aftermath of his death. "How does one respond to such a brutal act?" they said. Having a loved one tortured and lynched produced an unimaginable sense of loss and pain, yet retaliation, hateful speech, or promotion of hate-ridden propaganda never entered our mind. We thought, what would Jesus have done? How would he have responded? The answer was crystal clear. His message would have been one of peace and hope. I got a bunch of wild camping stories from back in the day, but there was only one time that I was ever really terrified. Bears and snakes, they're all hella scary, but there's stuff that you can do to avoid getting bitten or attacked or whatever. You can hang onto bear mace or wear above the ankle hiking boots and rest easy knowing that you've done something to keep yourself safe. But when you're caught with your pants down in the middle of the night and you got no effing idea what's out there, that kind of fear hits different. So, my best buddy through all of middle school and high school was this kid, Beto. And Beto ended up going to UT Austin to study a business degree, so every so often, I drove over to Austin to go visit him. But then this one time, he gets this idea that he wants to take me on a camping trip to Longhorn Cavern State Park. I say it like that because I can't think of anyone less likely to want to go on a camping trip. But when he explained how dope it was going to be and how we'd be completely free out there to do whatever without ever having to worry about cops or anything like that, it did start sounding like something I might enjoy. I'd never been that much on walking or being outdoors, but smoking out of a tent before grilling up a bunch of costillas and corn, I'll show up for that. But what I didn't know is that there was less chance of me filling my plate and more chance of me filling my pants, if you know what I mean. Anyway, so we drive over there, walk out into the woods, set up our camp, and get to doing our thing. Before that, we'd always had to worry about getting pulled over or caught smoking or whatever, and it sucked, but then out in the woods, it was completely different. I didn't like all the bugs, like that part really sucked about it, but just chilling by the fire, listening to tunes, and passing blunts, I gotta admit, it was pretty alright. But then, the forest started to get dark, and I don't know if you've lived your whole life in the city and then suddenly decided to sit by a campfire in the middle of the woods while the sun goes down, but it gets weird out there at night. All kinds of things start creeping around and making noises, and every one of them had me like, what was that? Does it eat people? Get the gun out, dude, get the gun out. He just thought it was hilarious, and in all fairness to him, I was kind of overreacting for the comedic value. And then he says, that's an owl, dude. I'm not shooting an owl, they're cool. And we played it off like that until I kind of settled into how noisy it can get at night in the woods. We stayed up for a while, just talking and smoking and drinking, and then once our eyes started getting heavy, we kicked a bunch of dirt over the fire and then got into our tent. My buddy, he's used to sleeping out in the woods like that because he'd been doing a bunch of hiking with friends from college. But me, I just lay there for like a whole entire hour, staring at the ceiling or whatever you call the top of a tent, imagining a bear's head just coming through the door of the tent and eating me alive, junk first. Like the other stuff, that sounds kind of funny to think about now, and I kind of knew that I was being a big baby about it, but I swear to God, I started hearing another kind of sound, a bigger sound, and it was way closer than the others. It sounded like something rubbing up against a tree or leaning on it real hard to the point that it was actually creaking. Right away I sit up thinking, yo, this is different because, like I said, what the hell is so big that's making a whole tree creak like that? And it's close, so I didn't like that at all. I hear the tree creaking even more, louder too, so I wake my buddy up saying, what's that noise, my guy? I'm half expecting him to just say like, oh, that's a lesser spotted whirlpool or whatever crazy animal name he was saying before, but he doesn't. He sits up, same as me, and starts getting this real wigged out look on his face. That sent me into a low-level panic because the whole time he'd been super chill about everything, so whatever was getting him reaching for his gun like that had to be bad. And right after, we hear some more creaking on the tree, heavier this time, so he gets his gun ready and points it at the tent door like he's expecting some big bear to rip through at any second. I'm wondering to myself by that time, like, why didn't I bring a gun too? Because whatever it was sounded like it'd take way more than just a 9mm to take it down. Then right when I think that I'm about to completely lose my mind, we hear this big creak, followed by this insanely loud snap, and a screech so loud and blood-curdling that I swear that I feel like I was about to rip through the back of the tent with my bare hands and just run off into the darkness. But we just held still, too scared to move, just waiting in the best defense position that we could, even though we were probably still horribly unprepared for whatever the hell was outside breaking down trees. After the screech, everything went completely quiet, like so quiet that I could hear my own heart beating in my chest, and we just waited, too scared to even breathe until we were finally convinced that whatever had been out there was gone. I wanted to pack up our stuff and get out of there right away, but my buddy said that it'd be a worse idea to run. Whatever it was, we needed to stand our ground because if we ran, it'd probably chase us, and something that big doesn't lose what it chases. We even think about sleeping, and the most we advanced out of the tent was to unzip the front flap and shine our light out to make sure that nothing was just hiding out there. Now, my buddy was incredibly brave as he kept his gun trained on that opening, but we waited until dawn to head out and look around. We saw the tree right away, lying less than 50 yards away, totally uprooted, but completely dead too. And that's when my buddy started to act relieved, like we didn't have a problem. He said dead trees like that fall over sometimes, and although it might have scared the hell out of us, we were never in any true danger. Beto then took a look around the tree and then pointed at what he said were some porcupine spines. I didn't know porcupines even climb trees, but Beto said that's what explained the evil screaming sound we heard. Poor little dude had been up in the tree sleeping, then woke up to it falling. He was probably more scared than we were. And that all makes sense to me, and I'm not saying I know any better than him, because that dude's smart, and he always has been. But what he was never able to explain was what made the tree fall down in the first place. He said it himself. He didn't notice it when we were making our camp, and he knew to keep an eye out for dead trees. Not even for safety either, because they make great firewood. He hadn't seen any that looked dead enough to really just topple over, but then there it was, right there in front of us, roots all freaky and tentacle-looking as they stuck out of the ground. I've talked to one or two people about this since, and they think it was maybe a black bear trying to get up to the porcupine, and maybe the tree falling down scared both of them off. Sure, that makes sense again, and I'm not trying to say it was Bigfoot or anything like that, but neither of us actually saw what it was, so we can't say for sure what it was or what it wasn't, right? And I'm telling you, it sounded way bigger than just a black bear. They're not even all that big. Are you saying a bear went for that tree over the smell of food that must have been all over our camp? Because that's the question that got my buddy thinking like, huh, and the one that still has me thinking, I'm never going out into the woods again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember,